Reveals in the video, being a mercenary doesn't mean that your work will be focused on special operations, or that you'll have it any easier than the native Russian troops on the ground. Like so many thousands of Russians before, you will be placed into the meat grinder of a war of attrition that is very likely to kill you quickly. If it doesn't, you'll be left in a terrible state. So what can we learn from Li Jianwei and his experiences on the battlefield? The simple answer? The Ukraine war is brutal for all soldiers on the ground. But first, a little about the mercenaries that Russia is bringing into the fold. The use of mercenaries is nothing new to Russia. It has several paramilitary groups already, each of which fights for money, and is generally in support of Russia's objectives. Perhaps the most famous of these is the Wagner Group, the paramilitary force that Russia deploys all over the world. But there are others. Redout, for instance, was one of the first groups to enter Ukraine and played a role in the initial invasion back in February 2024. There is also the Don Brigade, which has links to Redout, and is listed in Russia's Ready Reserve system of fighters. The point is simple. It's already well known that Russia is using mercenaries. However, the emergence of Li Jianwei's video shows that it's looking further afield to find these mercenaries. Its typical paramilitary groups, though not official parts of the Russian military, were at least Russian in origin. With the introduction of Chinese mercenaries, Russian President Vladimir Putin is showing a In May 2023, important stories reported that around half of the deaths the Russian military has experienced in Ukraine are not caused by life-threatening wounds. Rather, they occur due to improper medical care, or in many cases, a complete lack of care being provided to soldiers who suffer injuries. That's the opinion of Artem Kutulin, who's the head of the Kalashnikov Concern's Tactical Medicine Training Center. Majority won't make it through an offensive. Li claims to have spent about a month under these conditions, noting that many of the rooms and basements he fought through were already lined with rotting corpses from both sides. People died, constantly. And as Artem Kutulin pointed out, Li's team had no medical personnel to help them. In the end, Li claims only he, a Russian soldier, a fighter from Nepal, and another mercenary he calls Little Black, made it back from the offensive alive. All were carrying injuries. The Nepalese fighter had been hit by 4 pieces of shrapnel, with Little Black also taking shrapnel to the arm and leg. As for Li, he claims to have been hit by a bomb and thrown to the top of one of the houses his team was attempting to take, but he was lucky. He had a bulletproof vest on, meaning that most of his body was protected. He escaped from the situation with minor shrapnel wounds on his arms, though it's likely that the hemorrhaging he talks about was a result of the bomb attack. So we start to see both the nature of the fighting taking place in Ukraine, as well as the makeup of the Russian military conducting strikes on Ukrainian positions. Soldiers are fighting street to street, and as in Li's case, often house to house, to gain any scrap of territory they can. It's partially that weaponization of urban territory that's helped Ukraine survive for so long against Russia. As the Modern War Institute at West Point highlights, the Ukraine war has shown us that all cities are important in war, even those with no military value. Ukraine is defending every city, regardless of its tactical value, because keeping those cities represents a symbolic victory. For Russia, this means its soldiers are being forced into tight urban combat in areas that seem to offer little value, resulting in thousands of soldiers on both sides seemingly dying for no reason. Li offers his own perspective. He calls street combat very brutal, noting that it's not at all like he imagined. That seems to showcase how the use of supposed veterans by Russia isn't as effective a plan as it would seem. A veteran may as well be a new recruit when forced into a type of warfare with which they're unfamiliar. Many died, says Li, pausing for a moment of contemplation before simply repeating those 2 words. Li then moves on to a story involving himself, Little Black, and a pair of Russians. Together they formed a reconnaissance team to scout out a building. The team was also combat ready, with Li saying that if they ran into any Ukrainians, they would be ready to fight. But they didn't find Ukrainian soldiers. Instead, they found drones. Just like Li's group, the drones were conducting reconnaissance. They were also armed with bombs, which Li calls bocheka. He's likely talking about the Bayraktar TB2 drone, which is Turkish-made and has been widely used by Ukraine in the war. The drones are so popular that their Turkish manufacturer is considering plans to open a manufacturing plant in Ukraine, which would employ 500 people and be capable of producing 120 units annually. Li says the drones have two modes of attack, with his reconnaissance group ultimately finding themselves being peppered by bomb and kamikaze drone strikes. He got hit by one of the bombs, which destroyed his back. Following his description of the drone attack, Li moves on to the weapons he and his comrades have available. Specifically, he notes the sound that Polish mortars make, describing it almost as though it operates using a hydraulic system that propels the explosives into the air with a quiet whoosh sound. That's different from what Li is used to, as he describes typical mortars as having three sounds. Media group: traditional mortars being launched with loud explosion, soldiers firing modern mortars, Chistok, distribute equally, the explosion upon launch, a whistle as the weapon flies, and finally the second, much larger explosion when it hits its target. Li's conclusion: these mortars are very dangerous. Again, Li's reports of his experience seem to align with independent reports talking about how out of date the equipment Russia's forces receive really is. In October 2022, The Guardian published a report in which it covered a phone call made between a Russian woman named Olesya Shishkanova and her brother, who was a soldier on the front lines of the war. That brother, named Vladimir, not only discussed how the equipment he had was extremely old, but that he was also forced to buy much of it himself. They gave us absolutely no equipment. The army has nothing. We had to buy all our gear ourselves, he complains. I even had to paint my gun to cover the rust. It's a nightmare. Individual experiences like Li's and Vladimir's seem to mirror the wider Russian approach to the war, which is that having outdated equipment is better than having no equipment at all. In August 2023, the Moscow Times reported that Russia had pulled thousands of Soviet-era military vehicles from storage to send onto the battlefield. It notes that the Vajanovo military base, a 3.8-square-mile Soviet-era base that previously contained 3,840 tanks and armored vehicles, had lost about half of its inventory. That's a trend it reported across multiple Russian bases. Less than a year later, in March 2024, the Jerusalem Post reported that Russia was on the verge of exhausting the Soviet-era equipment these bases house. Blame them for running before going on to claim that these desertions are the reason why you can't trust anybody on the battlefield. Interestingly, Li quickly partially walks back that comment with the qualifier outside China, claiming that the PLA doesn't have this problem as a Chinese soldier is like a brother in life and death. They will sacrifice themselves to save you. A subtle dig at Russia's military when compared to the PLA? Perhaps. Battle in the woods that Li faced, or assigned to the urban combat on the front lines. Morale is clearly a major problem. Returning to Li's story, those morale issues aren't being made any better by the fact that Russian troops barely have any food with them on the front lines. Li notes that his arrival at the front lines was accompanied by a resupply that allowed him to actually eat a meal. That situation didn't last long. Li says that he ate canned food just 3 times during his deployment, after which he didn't eat anything other than 4 pieces of butter he happened to find while patrolling. There's a sad tinge to this aspect of the video, with Li looking almost wistful as he talks about how he once ate 2 cans of food, one containing beef and the other chicken, after talking about the lack of food on the front. Again, this appears to align with reports from the battlefield. In October 2023, Business Insider reported on an intercepted phone call purported to be between a Russian soldier and his wife. The soldier tells his wife, "We haven't had food delivered to us for 3 weeks. Today is already the 7th day since we've been brought water." The situation had gotten so bad for the soldier that he no longer had the strength to wear his bulletproof vest. The soldier also backs up Li's fatality rate claims, saying that the Russian officials don't care about his unit, which had lost about 100 men in just a few days. Around 18 months earlier, the Modern War Institute also wrote a piece dubbed Russia's Potemkin Army. It noted that the meals, ready-to-eat, or MRE rations issued to the Russian troops as part of the initial invasion in February 2022 contained rations that had supposedly expired in 2015. The situation was so bad, the Institute claims, that Russia had to request up-to-date MREs from China to supplement its troops. This information reveals 2 things about Russia's special military operation. Beyond using outdated equipment and filling its army with conscripts who don't want to be in battle, Russia also appears to have failed to set up any logistical system capable of keeping its soldiers supplied, Food and water aren't making it to the front lines, with some of Russia's soldiers being on the verge of starving as they fight. That's certainly the case for the soldier Business Insider reported on, who was so weak that he couldn't bear to wear a key piece of protective equipment. Li experienced the same issues himself, surviving for several days on just a couple of cans of food and a few pieces of butter. Again, it's the Russian meat grinder at play. The troops appear to be there to soak up Ukrainian ammunition, and they will be replaced when they die. The second thing it reveals is that Putin appeared to assume that Russia would steamroll through Ukraine during the early days of the war. Perhaps that's why he felt it was fine to send troops in with expired rations. They wouldn't be needed long enough for those rations to become a problem. Of course, that turned out to be incorrect, with the war having raged for well over 2 years by the making of this video. A lack of food likely also feeds into the previously mentioned morale problem. Tanks got to the battlefield, they'd know, he says. Drones swiftly arrive with anti-tank rockets and C4 explosives. They launch 2 or 3 explosives and the tank becomes a pile. Thus, Li explains, Russia's soldiers often feel that they have nowhere to hide. Thanks to the fleets of drones flying through Ukraine's skies, along with the intelligence the country is able to gather, even something as simple as deploying a tank is fraught with danger. The soldiers never know where the next rocket will come from until it's too late. Combine that with street combat, for which most Russian soldiers are unprepared, and you get a terrifying situation. Ruthlessness exists on both sides, Li claims, with that approach being necessary. Neither can afford to let the other side care for its wounded or gain a foothold during an assault. You have nowhere to hide, Li exclaims. To demonstrate the non-stop nature of the fighting, Li goes on to say that after he'd successfully evacuated from the reconnaissance patrol that saw his 4-person team try to run away, he regrouped with soldiers from other troops. With no time to rest or recover, the newly formed group had to attack a pair of strongholds, losing dozens of people in the process. The casualties were just left on the streets. Over the next 2 weeks, Li's unit launched 3 offensives and failed every time. Li believes they advanced only 100 meters, around 328 feet, during those 3 attacks. Again, that appears to be indicative of Russia's strategy. It's taking territory, it controls much of the Donbass region as well as Melitopol. It's also taking some territory near Kharkiv, but those advances are slow, with Russia inching forward while throwing soldier after soldier against the Ukrainian defenses. Perhaps Putin's approach is simple. So what can we it doesn't matter if offensives fail time and again, as long as he can keep sending enough troops to the front lines to slowly wear down the Ukrainian resistance. And every step of the war, as Li points out, Russia's forces not only have to deal with drone strikes, but also have to overcome trenches, barbed wire, and other fortifications, add mines and anti-tank mines into the mix, and every foot gained is a foot that likely costs the lives of several Russian soldiers. Those soldiers don't even have time to think about the mines, says Li. They're too busy dealing with drones, rifle grenades, heavy machine guns. All get focused on them whenever they launch an offensive, cutting huge swaths of the Russian soldiers down as they try to gain ground. It's been mentioned before, and it's worth repeating, the Ukraine war, from the Russian perspective, is a meat grinder in which thousands are being sacrificed to gain territory. It's already well known that Russia is using mercenaries. However, the emergence of those soldiers aren't safe even after a successful offensive. Li notes that building defenses is the priority as soon as Russian soldiers take a building, because they know the fighting isn't going to stop. Radio channels are changed hourly, with those who miss the change being out of luck. They're cut out of the loop and have no way of contacting their fellow soldiers unless they happen upon them. As for defenses, the Russian occupiers have to set them up quickly, because otherwise their positions will be marked by Ukrainian mortars and pelted with explosives. If you slack off, Li claims, the drones will come, followed by explosives and cluster munitions. The message is simple. Even when Ukraine loses territory, it refuses to give up on it. He begins by telling the audience that he's mostly recovered. The video ends with Li changing location, sitting with Little Black in what appears to be a temporary safe house. He tells viewers that he's been in combat for 4 days and nights. He tells us that street combat costs too many lives, including those of his comrades. Of 12 people in his unit, most died and a handful were injured. More came to replace them, Li says, but they died too. The camera turns to Little Black, who Li says follows him everywhere. The man is barely able to mumble words into the camera before Li turns it back on himself. His conclusion about the war, it's all a result of Russian stubbornness. Putin
It's
won't
not
end the
providing
fighting,
soldiers,
no matter how many
mercenary or
soldiers Russia
otherwise,
loses.
with adequate
And it's
medical
men like
support.
Li and his comrades
This is a
who will be
problem that
dying in
seems
their
like it's
thousands
baked
on the
into the
Ukrainian
Russian
battlefield.
military.
In the background, the police's Every Breath You Take
In May
plays,
2023,
a brief moment of
important
respite
stories
for Li
reported
and
that
Little
around
Black
half of
before
the
they
deaths
head
the
back into
Russian
the
military
fighting.
has
If
experienced
nothing
in
else,
Ukraine
Li's video
are not
shows
caused
that the
by
reports of
life-threatening
conditions,
wounds.
particularly
Rather,
for Russian
they
soldiers
occur
in the
due to
Ukraine
improper
war,
medical care,
don't appear to
or in
be
many
exaggerated.
cases, a
But what do you
complete lack
think?
of care being
Has
provided
Russia
to
done a poor
soldiers who
job of
suffer
keeping
injuries?
its people equipped
That's
during the
opinion
fighting?
of Artem
Will its
Kukulin,
approach of
who's the
throwing
head of the
thousands of
Kalashnikov
soldiers at
Concern's
Ukraine work in
Tactical
the
Medicine
end?
Training Center.
Tell us what you think in the
In addition
comments,
to
and thank
revealing
you
the
for watching the
disturbing
video.
statistic, he claims that about a third of the amputations being carried out on Russian soldiers happens because